Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and we are about to dig underneath Narnia. We're going to go into the dark places to discover a bit of what lies underneath the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This presentation that you're about to watch originally came out of my independently led course called The Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis, which covers the majority of his major works of fiction, and that includes Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, the Screwtape Letters, That Hideous Strength, Till We Have Faces, The Great Divorce, all of the Chronicles of Narnia, and then a little bit on The Dark Tower, which was Lewis's first and incomplete attempt at a sequel to Out of the Silent Planet. The course also includes many side lessons that take a look at relevant essays and other nonfiction works, such as The Abolition of Man, The Weight of Glory, Myth Became Fact, and more. And other texts, such as The Discarded Image, are discussed along the way as well. This was a really fun and a really enriching course to put together. It originally ran during the first part of the summer of 2024, and it included over 60 participants. And so it was really a great community, and many of the most active participants are still active today as we stay in touch through Discord and have some plans to do some more things together in the future. I decided that I wanted to release one of the main videos to the public so you could all have a taste of what this course consists of. And I decided to go with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for a couple of reasons. First, it's obviously the most widely known of Lewis's stories. However, the main reason I'm going this route is because the Narnia series was placed toward the end of the course, and so for that reason, I was able to be a bit more free-flowing with my references to Lewis's other stories. And so this provides a good demonstration of how Lewis's ideas come together. And if you enjoy this presentation and you would like full access to this course, as well as to join our ongoing Discord channel, then you have a couple of options. First, you can purchase the entire course in the form that it was originally delivered by going over to andrewsnyder.podia.com. This will give you immediate access to all of the primary and secondary lessons, as well as the recorded weekly Zoom conversations from the live run. The other option is to become a patron of Mythic Mind at the third tier or higher, and so right now that's the $25 tier and higher at patreon.com/mythicmind. This will give you full access to all of the course videos, as well as the audio delivered through the Patreon podcast feed. And of course, this will also give you full access to all of the other Mythic Mind Patreon content as well. And so again, that is andrewsnyder.podia.com or patreon.com/mythicmind. And now, without further ado, here is my dive into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Hello and welcome to our study of the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yes, indeed, the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, obviously, there's some debate over the order that we should read Narnia. Some people argue, and most modern prints provide you with a chronological ordering, and so we begin with The Magician's Nephew, which tells of the creation of Narnia, and then they follow the in-story sequence of events, the in-story chronology, and that's how they arrange the books. Now, I, and really most Lewis people, right, most Lewis scholars argue that we should go with the publication order, the order in which these books were originally released. Just looking to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think it's important that we, as the readers, that we enter into Narnia with Lucy, and just as significantly, that we enter into Narnia at the same point that C.S. Lewis himself did. This was originally written to be our introduction into Narnia. In fact, originally, he wasn't sure that there even would be other books. He just had this story in mind, and then the others kind of just fell into place, as he says, as mentioned in the last video, as Aslan really pulled him along. But this was his entry point. This is the entry point for Lucy. I think that this should be the entry point for us as well. Now, I should also mention that I had originally thought about providing one larger video that covers this entire unit for this week, and so Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but I've decided that instead I'm going to split this up into shorter videos for each one. And I think that just makes things more convenient for you. As you read each of these books, you can go back and look at the video for just that particular chunk of content. And it's also going to allow me to get some content out to you faster in case I run a little bit behind as I've been doing recently. And one last caveat before we move forward, and that is that these are not going to be exhaustive studies that I'm providing for you. This entire course is covering so much material from where we started with Ransom up to where we are now that we're only able to cover any of these stories in something of a survey style. As I've been mentioning for the last few studies, I would love at some point to lead an entire study that just does an intensive deep dive into the Chronicles of Narnia. But for this study, what I'm really interested in doing is just highlighting some key moments, highlighting some key themes, focusing on the philosophy that Lewis is giving us through these stories. And so I hope that I provide you with some good guideposts here. Now, starting with first impressions, I've come to learn that Lewis's first paragraphs in his stories are usually very significant. Usually he's setting up some very important themes here. Now, in this first paragraph of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we have the kids arrive at the professor's house, and we're told that the professor himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head. And they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. And so right away, we learned something about Lucy's character and about Edmund's character. So Lucy, she likes the professor, but she has some fear of him. And on one hand, this could just be some childlike fear. I have twin 2-year-olds. I understand that kids can sometimes get shy. But Lewis is usually telling us something more than that kind of obvious fact. Or at least he's telling us that and something else. I think what he's telling us here is that Lucy is able to experience a degree of reverence for the strange, a degree of reverence for the wise, a degree of reverence for that which is beyond and likely above her current station. And I think that's one reason why she is the first one allowed into Narnia, and why she has a particular attachment to Aslan, because she is able to posture herself appropriately before him in a kind of reverence and a kind of healthy fear. As opposed to Edmund, who sees the other, he sees that which is a little bit odd according to his framework, and he's given over to laughter. He's unable to enter into the solemn, which is an important word for Lewis that I'm going to come back to in a little bit. But so Edmund can't take things seriously, largely because he takes himself too seriously. And so Edmund is the archetypal scoffer here, and obviously that's going to come back to bite him in a very real way in this story. Now, not long into the story, Lucy finds her way into Narnia through this strange wardrobe. And so the kids are playing a game together. Lucy goes to hide, and she hides herself in the wardrobe. And it says that, looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. And that statement right there, that she loves the feel of fur, might point to the fact that she's going to be very much at home in Narnia, this land inhabited by all kinds of furry creatures. But also, most importantly, it might speak to her connection, her, at this point, subconscious desire for Aslan. We're told later on that when Aslan invites her to feel his fur, that this is something that she had always wanted to do but was afraid to do until she was summoned to do so. And so she has this unconscious desire. She's pulled toward Aslan, despite the fact that at this point she has no idea as to who Aslan is. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. By the way, just as a quick side note, you may be wondering why Lewis repeats this multiple times, that it's so foolish to shut oneself inside any wardrobe, it's foolish to close the doors. It seems kind of odd for him to really emphasize that, but really this comes from the fact that Owen Barfield's wife was afraid that some kids would read this and lock themselves in wardrobes. And so it's really just as simple as that. Lewis is taking Maud Barfield's warnings here, her cautions into mind, and trying to make sure that no kid reads the story and then locks himself into a wardrobe. But I do want to point out the connections here between Lucy entering Narnia through the wardrobe, this land that's going to lead to her enchantment, her ennobling, this land, this experience, this Aslan-led journey that's going to lead her to become more herself. And I want to talk about that in connection with this scene from That Hideous Strength. And I briefly alluded to this connection when we were reading That Hideous Strength, but I think it's worth looking back for that now. Now, this is toward the end of the story, toward the end of That Hideous Strength, when all of the Oyarsu are descending on St. Anne's, and the women are upstairs trying on all of these marvelous clothes and just marveling in each other's beauty. That same afternoon, Mother Dimble and the three girls were upstairs in the big room, which occupied nearly the whole top of the floor of one wing at the manor, and which the director called the wardrobe. If you had glanced in, you would have thought that for one moment that they were not in a room at all, but in some kind of forest. A tropical forest glowing with bright colors. A second glance, and you might have thought that they were in one of those delightful upper rooms at a big shop, where carpets standing on end and rich stuffs hanging from the roof make a kind of woven forest of their own. In fact, they were standing amidst a collection of robes of state, dozens of robes which hung, each separate, from its little pillar of wood. And so here they're in this great room that's called the wardrobe, and we're told that if you looked in, that at first it would look like they were in some kind of forest. And obviously Lucy is passing through a wardrobe into a forest. And so there is this thematic, this imaginative connection here in Lewis's mind between entering into a wardrobe and donning the more real you, which is an interesting contrast to Perelandra, where Tinadril was tempted by the unman with wearing clothes, and for her that was a movement away from herself. But because we have been stripped in the inappropriate way, in the sense that we have lost part of ourselves, well, we now actually need to don something, right? We need to put on our true self. We need to put on Christ, as Paul tells us. And in putting on Christ, we are also becoming more ourselves, we as we were meant to be. And I think that's what's happening here in the scene in That Hideous Strength, that the women are symbolically putting on themselves, their true selves, and that's why they are beaming with radiance and they're able to just rejoice in each other's beauty, because they are participating in the great dance as they don the attire that is appropriate for doing so. And I think that Lucy herself and the kids who follow in her wake, her brothers, at least by the end, and her sister, that they are entering into Narnia that they might put on their true selves. And I think it is really interesting how we see these echoing themes here playing out in these stories, that I think Lewis is telling us the same thing in different ways. Now, we do need to talk a little bit about this first character that Lucy meets, Mr. Tumnus, who is not quite as innocent as he may appear initially. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black. And instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first, because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler round his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, and a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck two horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other he carried several brown paper parcels. It looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a faun. Now, if you know your mythology, you'll recognize that a faun is also known as a satyr. Now, these are not friendly creatures. In fact, they tend to be quite wicked creatures. And keep in mind that later on, Mr. Beaver is going to tell the kids that they need to be very careful when it comes to things that look human but aren't human. And that would very much include the satyr. And so on one hand, the bottom half of a faun, the bottom half of a satyr, is beastly. It is that of a goat, that of an animal. And animals don't live within the realm of morality. They live according to instinct. And it is very significant for these creatures that it is their bottom half that is goat-like, because they are driven by animalistic, very often sexual desire. And so the satyr is very much a sexually driven creature. Its bottom half is that of a goat, but it has the cunning mind of a human. And that's a very dangerous combination. to be driven by beastly instincts with access to reason at its disposal. And so these are very seductive creatures. And supposedly this is one of the problems that Tolkien had with Narnia. Now, I mean, he famously had a number of problems with Narnia, but a lot of it comes down to his view that Lewis was misusing mythology. Supposedly Tolkien said that if a young girl were to meet a satyr in the woods, well, he wouldn't have her over for a tea party. He likely would have something far more visceral and diabolical in mind, and I'll just leave it at that. And the thing is, even though Lewis is providing this account for children, and so he is going to soften a lot of that satyr imagery, is still very much present in the details that we are given. And even look at this picture, as the faun has his hand on Lucy, really guiding her. He's got an umbrella, and so there's this sense that he is bringing her under his protection, and then he brings her to his home, and we're given details like, in one corner there was a door, which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, A Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? And so there are two main details that are given here regarding Mr. Tumnus's home. On one hand, we're told where his bedroom is. Nothing else is said about that, but it's enough to raise the question, why did Lewis mention that? Lewis is not flippant with his details. What he includes is intentional, and so he is setting a certain theme here, a certain mood here, and so he's intentional about pointing out where Mr. Tumnus's bedroom is. But because this is a children's story, he cuts it off right there. But especially for the attentive adult reader, it becomes pretty clear that actually what we do see here is a kind of seduction taking place. And in fact, we even see something of this dual nature of the faun in this description. And so on one hand, there's this mention of the bedroom, which might speak to his bestial nature. But then we also get some focus on his books, which speaks to his intellect, to his rational nature, that are these things that are brought together. But even his life of the mind, even his books, have titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus. Now, Silenus is associated with Dionysus, which is the god of revelry and wine, and there's a lot of sensual stuff all wrapped up within that. And then nymphs and their ways, and nymphs are these female spirits that tended to be very dangerous, but also very promiscuous. And so there are these very subtle indicators of the sexual that really just pervade this entire scene in a way that kids are likely not going to understand, but are certainly there for those of us who know their mythology. And this is why I would very much defend what Lewis is doing here against the charge that Tolkien at least supposedly made here. I think that Lewis is very much keeping the heart of the satyr intact here, but just adapting it for children. Because what we see here is that he is seducing her in a manner of speaking. He is giving her the illusion of comfort. He is bringing her in that he might devour her, not by doing something sexual himself, but he's going to devour her by handing her over to the Lady of Death. And is that not essentially how the Proverbs describe seduction? That it appears very inviting, but it opens a hole to Sheol. And I think that that's what Mr. Tumnus is doing here until he gets some conviction and repents. Which tells us that although he may be a vile creature by nature, or at least by tendency, there is a possibility of redemption, that he is able to suppress his bestial nature and to live within his humanity, that he can climb up this chain of being from the animalistic to the rational, toward the virtuous. And this is very important for Greek philosophy, this idea that we have an animal soul, but we also have a rational soul. And to live the life of virtue, we need to let reason take the lead. And given Lewis's appreciation for Plato, I can't help but to think that there's some of that going on here. That we really see this Greek struggle for humanity taking place within Mr. Tumnus. And fortunately, Mr. Tumnus does repent, and he sends Lucy on her way, lets her go back home. And she tells her siblings about this adventure that she had, and obviously they don't believe her at first, and so they go and talk to the professor. And he really rebukes them, siding with Lucy. And he says, "Logic," said the professor half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. And this right here is obviously Lewis's liar, lunatic, or Lord apologetic that he gives us in Mere Christianity, in which he argues that Christ cannot just be a good teacher, that either he is a liar, he said things that are not true, or he is crazy, meaning he believed the things that he said, but they weren't true, or he is Lord. He is exactly who we said that he was. Well, if you look at his character, you look at what we're given of Christ's life, he doesn't seem to be a liar, nor does he manifest the symptoms of insanity, of madness. And so, we have good reason to believe that he is exactly who he says that he is. And this is the line of argument that the professor provides for defending the story of Lucy. Now let's talk a little bit about Edmund and the White Witch. And so when Edmund first follows Lucy into the wardrobe and makes his way into Narnia, not long after he gets separated from Lucy, he encounters the White Witch. And he approaches her saying, my name's Edmund, said Edmund, rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. Is that how you address a queen? She asked, looking sterner than ever. I beg your pardon, your majesty. I didn't know, said Edmund. Not know the Queen of Narnia, cried she. Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. And so early in the story, we get this conflict regarding authority. Obviously, we know as the reader, and the other kids will know soon enough, that Aslan is the true king of Narnia, but we have here an imposter. We have here a counterfeit monarch, a counterfeit sovereign, maybe even a counterfeit Jove. And I think it's very significant here that the villain of this story, which is really about authority, remember, as Michael Ward says, the planetary influence associated with the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is Jove, is Jupiter, the sovereign, the king. And here we have this conflict between the rightful King Aslan and the Queen of Narnia. And it's important for Lewis that Jove has a masculine quality to him. In fact, that he is masculine, because the masculine is that which asserts itself, and this is very important for the king, a king who leads, a king who guides, a king who orders the influences that are below it. The masculine asserts itself, and the feminine receives. Well, here we have the disordered feminine setting itself up in the place of Jove, trying to assert itself. But especially within this realm of myth that we're dealing with here, when the feminine asserts itself, well, you don't get new life because it's a perversion, it's a corruption of proper order. You get new life when the masculine asserts itself, the feminine receives, and in so doing, that gives rise, it gives birth to new life. The rain falls onto the earth, which then receives the rain and then produces vegetation. In fact, that's the very image that Arnhem gives for the relationship between Ungit and her husband. That the brute, who is sometimes her husband, that he rains water down, which is received into the earth which is very often associated with Ungit, especially toward the end of the book, and then Ungit receiving the rain gives rise to life, to vegetation. That's how life develops, that's how being is propagated, that's how joy and vitality abound. But when you have the feminine asserting itself, well, that's not going to lead to new life. That's just not how things work. And so what that is going to produce is an endless winter, an endless barrenness. All winter, no Christmas. Everything is going to be frozen over. And I'm going to say a little bit more about who I believe the White Witch is in a little bit. But for now, I want to focus mostly on Edmund. And so Edmund gets his loyalties wrong here. And so Edmund sides with the queen because, well, she gives himself and she promises him all of this power. If only he would follow her, if only he would blindly follow her commands, not really understanding exactly what's going on here. As long as he would blindly follow her, she would reward him with great power, with great authority. He would be in the inner ring. And I think that we see some strong connections here between Edmund's progression or digression and Mark Studdick's entryway into Bellbury. Jumping forward a bit, after the kids spend some time with the beavers and Edmund sneaks out to go to the witch's house, we get this description of that journey. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me, anyway. much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. And I think what we get here is really a distillation, or maybe a better way of saying that is a brief view at what we get more fully in Mark Studdick's pursuit of the Inner Ring. That he keeps pursuing this seat of power, this seat of influence, that which will make him special, that which will give him a place on the inside of things. He's trying to look for the center of things. But as he pursues the center, things become more confused. But really it's a willful confusion, because all along, Mark really does recognize that he's doing the wrong things. And that's why he doesn't want Jane to be part of Belbury, because he recognizes that if she showed up, well, then he would have to actually deal with reality, that he wouldn't be able to live in his delusion anymore. And so Mark is engaging in a willful delusion because he thinks, against reason, that this is going to lead him to a place of significance. And it's exactly what Edmund is doing. He is engaging in a willful delusion because he believes that this is the path to significance. This is the path to the Inner Ring. He's pursuing the center, not remembering that Meldil, or Aslan, is the center. Now, this is a significant scene, and so this is in the House of the Beavers, and this is when Aslan is first mentioned. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do, but the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream, that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. And all these responses are kind of on the nose. I mean, they don't necessarily require a great deal of analysis, even if I think that they do deserve some highlighting. So Edmund feels a sensation of mysterious horror. Remember in Perelandra, at the beginning, when the Lewis character approaches Malacandra, he approaches the Oyarsa in the house of Ransom. And he's really undone because he recognizes he's encountering goodness, but it's not at all the kind of meeting that he had expected with goodness. In fact, he felt a kind of horror. He is disturbed. He is undone, recognizing that he doesn't belong there. He doesn't belong in relation to goodness. Now, the Lewis character is a Christian, and so that is a pathway to greater intimacy, toward greater reflection, toward becoming more of a self. Edmund obviously is not there yet. He only experiences the horror at the good, even as surely, if darkness had a feeling, it would certainly feel horror when the light appears and it is forced to flee. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. In response to the great lion, well, he becomes lion-hearted. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. Now, a lot has been made of this, especially regarding what happens to Susan by the last battle. You know, is Lewis already giving us some sense that she isn't fully taken in by Aslan? That this delicious smell, this music, it floats by her, but doesn't necessarily enrapture her. And so maybe this is a way of saying that she was never fully in. Now, for what it's worth, I don't see any mandate to go into that direction. And we'll talk about this more when we get to the last battle and the so-called problem of Susan, which we're going to have to talk about because this is something that C.S. Lewis scholars love to talk about. And so we'll probably talk about this again. But for now, I just want to say that at this point, I really don't think that Lewis is telling us anything about Susan's relationship to Aslan other than the fact that his name, that his influence is drawing her in. And Lucy gets this feeling that you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. And so she has this joviality, this liberality, this freedom, which very much speaks to the jovial influence, that hard-won joy that comes after winter. And so Lucy experiences the beginning of the end of the winter. She is experiencing this hard-won joviality. Now, not long after this, we get the arrival of Father Christmas, and we're told that some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. And that word solemn is important for Lewis. In fact, before I say anything else, I want us to take a look at this short passage from Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. He says that the solemn is the festal, which is also the stately and the ceremonial, the proper occasion for pomp. And the very fact that pompous is now used only in some bad sense measures the degree to which we have lost the old idea of solemnity. To recover it, you must think of a court ball, or a coronation, or a victory march, as these things appear to people who enjoy them. And so we are told that Father Christmas is very solemn. And that's because he has a stately role to play. He is a representative of the jovial Aslan. He is an administrator of sorts, the intermediary between Jove and the children, who is calling them into action and equipping them for action. He is the herald of Aslan's victory march, which is already going to start taking place in the very near future. As the snow begins to melt and the waters are going to release, and they're going to experience plant life and experience the senses of spring with the smells of the flowers. All this is coming in the wake of this intermediary, Father Christmas, who is preparing the way for all who are able to enjoy such things, enjoy in the spirit of Jove. And after he gives everyone their presents, then they feast. And this also is a continuation of this jovial theme. On one hand, there's pomp. There is ceremony here, but there's also great festivity, which, again, all this together speaks to the jovial influence. And then, as Father Christmas leaves after this great feast, then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king!" And so, again, there's this emphasis on authority, on the true king as opposed to the false queen. And eventually, the kids and the beavers finally make their way to Aslan. And we're told that Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves around him in the shape of a half moon. There were tree women there, and well women, dryads and naiads as they used to be called in our world, who had stringed instruments. It was they who had made the music. There were 4 great centaurs. The horse part of them was like huge English farm horses, and the man part was like stern but beautiful giants. There was also a unicorn, and a bull with the head of a man, and a pelican, and an eagle, and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, of whom one carried his crown, and the others his standard. Now, there's a lot of imagery here taking place, but I think that the main point that Lewis is giving us is that Aslan is in control, and in his presence we see right order. And while we've already been warned against things that look kind of human, here we have things that look kind of human, right? We have centaurs, we have minotaurs, but these are creatures, these are hybrid creatures that have learned to maximize their humanity. They have learned to be rightly ordered in the presence of Aslan, even as Tumnus himself will get a second chance at life through the breath of Aslan. And so all of these creatures, all these people are in proper order surrounding their jovial king Aslan. Also, I think it's interesting this mention of a great dog with a capitalized D, which seems to indicate this is not just any dog, but that this is a very significant dog. And I don't know for sure, but I wonder, especially in light of a lot of this Greek imagery here, if the dog has some connection to Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld, which might speak to the fact that, especially in light of the things that are about to play out, that Aslan has authority even over death. And on that note, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the deep magic. At this point, Aslan has sent out his people to liberate Edmund from the house of the queen, and now the queen shows up and she is talking with Aslan. And she says, "Have you forgotten the deep magic?" And Aslan says, "Let us say that I have forgotten it. Tell us of this deep magic." And by the way, I love this. Now, I do appreciate that line in the movie when Aslan says, "Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. I was there when it was written." However, I actually appreciate more what Lewis does here, as Aslan gets the witch to tell him about the deep magic. And this reminds me in Paralandra, when the unman is talking about how great death is, and he wants to teach the woman death. And Ransom says to the unman, "Remind me what happened when Maleldil became acquainted with death. How did that work out for you?" And I think something very similar is happening here, in which the hero is making the villain, or is inciting the villain, to give a great boast of that which is going to be their defeat. And I think that Lewis is showing us here how evil ultimately consumes itself in the end. It is a continual movement toward nothing, and so evil tends to be its own undoing. In fact, it is its own undoing. That's what it means to be evil. It's a movement away from being. And the witch replies, "Tell you," said the witch, her voice growing suddenly shriller. "Tell you what is written on that very table of stone which stands beside us. Tell you what is written, in letters deep as a spear is long, on the firestones of the secret hill. Tell you what is engraved on the scepter of the Emperor beyond the sea. You at least know the magic which the Emperor put into Narnia at the very beginning. You know that every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and that for every treachery I must have a right to a kill." "Oh," said Mr. Beaver, "so that's how you come to imagine yourself a queen, because you were the Emperor's hangman. I see." Now, a lot of people look at this and think that Lewis is providing us with a ransom theory of the atonement, the idea that God had to give a ransom to Satan in order to secure salvation. And that's just bad theology, and if that's what Lewis were doing here, then I think that would be problematic, and it would mandate some serious criticism. But I actually don't think that's what's going on here. For one thing, we should always be careful not to read Lewis's fiction and then go straight into systematic theology with it, because he's telling stories, and stories are not the same thing as discursive systematic theology. We can certainly see Lewis's philosophy come out through his stories, but at the same time, we're in the realm of fairy tale here. It's the same kind of realm as myth, and when you're in the realm of myth, you can get away with some things that you can't get away with when you're preaching a sermon or when you're teaching a theology class, which is why I remember in Till We Have Faces, at one point the fox says that the gods aren't just. Well, you don't take from that Lewis is telling us God isn't just. No, you have to look into the story to see on a more dynamic level, what is that doing? On a rhetorical level, what is that doing? Where is that pushing us toward? And so in that sense, I think that Lewis was telling us something true here when the fox said the gods aren't just. But it would be wrong in a theology class if your professor told you God is not just. The genre very much matters here. But even setting that aside for a moment, but I'm not convinced here that Aslan is giving himself over to Satan. I think that instead what we see is love giving itself over to Ungit. Remember that for Lewis, as we've discussed many times by this point, the feminine influence can take two main directions. On one hand, you have the ideal feminine. This is Perelandra proper. This is baptized Venus. In the properly ordered position, the masculine asserts itself, the feminine receives, and gives birth to new life. Ransom, commissioned by Mars, is received by Venus, goes beneath the surface of Venus as he submits his martial prowess to her service, and in so doing, new life is established. Mark Studdock, in the end, learns to pursue Jane, who is waiting to receive him, and in so doing, we get this idea that new life is going to be established. The groom of Ungit reigns on the earth, which in a certain sense is Ungit, and she produces vegetation. Ansit does not assert herself into Barty's ambition, but receives him, and in so doing enables him to be more himself. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the consuming feminine. This is Orwell for much of her story, and this is who Ungit is to her, because, well, she is that Ungit. According to the fox, we are all Ungit. This version of Ungit is that which does not receive to produce new life, but that which consumes and gives nothing back. This is the devouring mother. This is the witch in Hansel and Gretel. This is the mother in The Great Divorce, who would take her son to hell if she could, if only he would be hers. This is death, as death receives our lives, and if she would have her own way, her own autonomous way, she gives nothing back. If Orwell threw herself into the river, she would not escape Ungit, for death is but another of her domains, or maybe even better yet, death is simply another face of Ungit. However, if you learn to die before you die, then death can become a servant to new life. It can become the producing mother, that which gives rise to new life. Even death can do this. Psyche learned this. She goes into the underworld to recover the beauty of the Queen of the Dead, so that the act of dying might be made beautiful as it's transformed into something life-giving. This is how Ungit is made beautiful. Had Ransom not descended into the earth of Perelandra, she likely would have become a devouring Ungit. But because he entered into the underworld in the right way, he played his role in making her beautiful. Well, I think that something very similar is happening here in Narnia. Of course, there is some significant devil imagery wrapped up in Jadis, as the devil is wrapped up in death itself. But I think that on a more primary level, Jadis is better understood as Ungit than as Satan. She is the devouring feminine. She is the death that receives, which is why all traitors, all who reject the proper order of Aslan, are hers by right. Those who reject order, they're embracing nothingness. They're moving away from life into death. And that's just why they are hers by right. This is what they choose. Now, as we're told in the Great Divorce, all who enter hell choose to be there. And so the punishment is the natural result of the orientation of the soul. However, Aslan willingly enters into death that it might be made beautiful. He recovers beauty from the Queen of the Dead. Aslan enters into death, and at the same time, death receives Aslan and gives rise to new life, not only for Edmund, but for Narnia. There's cosmic significance to this dive in this ascension, as there was for Ransom and Perelandra. Now, I should say that you can take this thesis for what it is. I have not seen or heard it anywhere else. So this is just coming from me, and I think that I need to work through it a little bit more, but I'm fairly convinced that I'm at least moving in the right direction with this. And I would love to hear your thoughts on my analysis. But back to the story itself. So Aslan dies, he rises from the dead, he goes and he liberates all of the statue people, gives them new life by breathing on them, and then he takes this army and wins the battle, and he himself, Aslan himself, defeats the White Witch, in a manner that very much reminds me of Mr. Bultitude. And then at the end, we get the coronation of the children at Cair Paravel. As they are sitting on the four thrones, they are fulfilling the prophecy spoken of them. They are going to bring Narnia into proper order, which again speaks to the jovial influence that saturates this entire story. That it's all about authority, the true authority of Aslan, the false authority of the witch. And now we get the authority of the kings and queens who are appointed by and under the higher rule of Aslan to put Narnia into proper order. Very jovial theme here. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. And Peter became tall and a deep-chested man, and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings in the countries beside the sea began to send ambassadors, asking for her hand in marriage. And she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. And so, again, proper ordering, Aslan is ultimately in charge, but Peter is appointed High King, and Edmund and his sisters are appointed kings and queens below him. And so we get a very firm hierarchy here that brings everything into proper order. The great dance is now playing out throughout Narnia. And as such, they are established as these legendary rulers in Narnia. As Ransom says on Perelandra, they begin to enact a myth rather than just go on an adventure. And so they are becoming these mythic rulers that are going to enter into the modern era, so to speak, in Prince Caspian. And that is where we will leave off for now. Until next time, Godspeed as you go further up and further in. I really hope that you found that to be enriching, and odds are if you watched it until the end, you probably did to some degree. And so, if you would like full access to this course, then you can head over to andrewsnyder.podia.com or patreon.com/mythicmind. You can find links to both of those in the notes below. And I hope to see you there as we go further up and further in. Until then, Godspeed.